Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Crooks, Curator Arts of Global Africa and the Diaspora at the AGO. I want to welcome you all to today's talk featuring artist Andrea Chung, art collector and advisor Schwanda Rountree, and Tyler Park, owner of Tyler Park Presents. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Toronto and the land the AGO is on, Mississauga Anishinaabe territory, Mississauga. It is also governed by a treaty between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Canadian government, and been occupied by other Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat confederacies. Today's talk is held in conjunction with the AGO exhibition Andrea Chung on view through October 1st. Thank you to TD Bank Group, our lead sponsor of the Department of the Arts of Global Africa and the Diaspora, supporting Andrea Chung's current installation through the TD Ready commitment, and to Canada Council for the Arts for supporting contemporary programming at the AGO. We'll save some time for audience questions towards the end of the talk. Please use the Q&A function to ask them. Closed captions are available, and we're recording today's talk. It will be available on ago.ca in the very near future. So by way of introduction, bear with me because I like to read full bios. Andrea Chung was born in New Jersey to Caribbean parents and lives and works in San Diego, California. She received a BFA from Parsons School of Design, New York, and an MFA from Maryland Institute College of Art, Baltimore. Her recent biennial and museum exhibitions include the Addison Museum of American Art, Prospect 4, New Orleans, and the Jamaican Biennial, Kingston, Jamaica, as well as the Chinese American Museum and California African American Museum in Los Angeles, and the San Diego Art Institute. In 2017, her first solo museum exhibition took place at the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego. You broke the ocean in half to be here. She's participated in national and international residencies, including the Vermont Studio Center, McCall Center for Visual Arts, Headland Center for the Arts, and Shawhagan School of Painting and Sculpture. Her work has been written about in Art File Magazine, New Orleans Times, Peking ArtNet, the Los Angeles Times, International Review of the African American Art, and I think the New York Times most recently. Among others. Her work is included in collections such as the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego, Rhode Island School of Design Museum, Novo Foundation, Cleveland Clinic Art and Medicine Institute, Minneapolis Institute of Art, Davis Museum at Wesley College, Addison Museum of American Art, J. Paul Getty Museum, and the AGO. Tyler Park is the owner and director of Tyler Park Presents in Los Angeles. He has previously held director-level positions at galleries such as Francois Gabali, if I pronounce that properly, The Pit and Cloud and Man, before opening Tyler Park Presents in September 2020. The gallery's mission seeks to provide space, opportunity, and resources through exhibitions, projects, and representation of domestic and internationally based artists. Schwanda Rountree is an attorney and independent art consultant. Schwanda has worked with galleries both domestically and internationally in placing contemporary art in museums and private collections. She currently serves as National Advisory Council member of Creative Capital, professional arts consultant for the Joan Mitchell Foundation, collections committee member of the Ackland Art Museum, National Advisory Board member at the Ackland Art Museum, and accessions committee member of the Baltimore Museum of Art. She's also served as advisory panel member of the Cultural IDC and executive board member of the Porter Colloquium on African American Art and a member of Art Table. Recently, she was featured in Artsy's Inside My Collection editorial profile, as well as Art News. Welcome to you all. I'm thrilled that we could have this conversation, and as we'll see where it goes, but I'm really excited about delving more deeply into Andrea's work. So I'm going to share my screen. And I just want to I want you to indulge me because I want to start with Andrea's artist statement that you've so beautifully written on your website that I think really sums up the breadth and range of your practice for those who are not familiar. My work connects the innumerable layers of exploitation that resulted from centuries of colonialism and the implications that are still felt presently. I focus primarily on island nations in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, which are extensions of my own ancestral legacy and familial narrative. I'm particularly interested in labor and how materials, locations, and cultural processes can be combined to illuminate the often erased stories of people who were treated as currency within colonial workforces. More importantly, I seek to amplify the acts, ideologies, and practices that survive despite the fragmentation of history that occurred throughout the transatlantic slave trade and present-day forced migration. I make work that incorporates materials that are representative of these cultures and or signify broader themes of labor and geographic movement. Often ephemeral in nature, my work regularly incorporates themes related to the reclamation of feminine power, dark humor, and the distortion of seduction and beauty as vehicles for cultural criticism and the rejection of a whitewashed history. So I think, Andrea, that this so sums up your work and the kind of continuation of your practice. And I will delve into more deeply into your practice further on in our conversation. But I guess I wanted to begin with how you continue to expand and work through these themes using a range of materials, as well as your interest in both photography and mining the colonial archive for source material. It's a big question, but I just wanted to kind of start there to kind of begin the conversation.
I think that there's just limitless material to work with. And a big part of my practice is always teaching myself how to do a new process. So like right now I'm teaching myself how to net weave with beads, which I've never done before. And, you know, kind of thank God for YouTube. So I try to sort of like take the mundane objects that we sort of take for granted and explore them and sort of talk about the exploitation of the object or the person that's within these mundane materials, particularly archival materials that I think that we don't necessarily pay a whole lot of attention to. So with some of the works that are in the show, in particular at AGO, it was looking at these old postcards, these vis-a-vis postcards that were taken during the 18th and 19th century that were used they were used as tourist items to sort of distribute around the world of, look, I've been to this place. But in the midst of doing that, it was also showing the exploitation of particularly Black women's bodies, shaming them for their nudity, this idea of civilizing the primitive. So I'm really interested in sort of like discussing that imagery and how we may turn a blind eye to it, but you know, there's a lot to sort of extract and tease out from that kind of material. And it's also not that different from some of the, you know, the modern, you know, tourism material that's put out there in the world, particularly in parts of the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to just turn it quickly to Tyler and Schwanda. First, Tyler, as the gallery that represents Andrea's work, what was it that initially drew you to her practice, given all of the complexities of the themes and concepts and the material that she's working with? What was it about the ways in which Andrea was producing or thinking about her work that also stood out for you?
Well, I think for me, the use of materials is really interesting. but also the underlying histories allows me to have different moments or histories to point to, which I think as a gallerist is just makes like talking about work a lot more accessible and easier for me. But I guess, you know, how we ended up working together was, if we kind of go back a little bit, we were both brought into Cloud and Man. I was added as their director the same week that she was added to their roster. So we grew really closely together as kind of like the new people to the gallery. And when the gallery decided to close, she was the only artist out of the group that I had the most connection with and felt that I can talk about her work properly and kind of continue to keep moving things along. And our relationship was really good. So we started working together. She was the first artist I technically represented with my gallery, which has evolved now to 5 different artists over the last 2 years. But yeah, I think, you know, it's, for me as a gallerist, being able to like talk about work is really important to me and feeling confident about it. And I think because of that back history of like being in the director position and working with her work really allowed me to kind of like have that relationship continue with my gallery and kind of bypass all the kind of like bumps and different things like that that you would have when you start working with an artist from scratch.
I would also like to add that I really enjoyed being repped by Cloud and Man, and you know, a big part of it was working with both Deb and Tyler. And to be quite honest, you know, when the gallery closed, I kind of like had this freak out moment, but we had also just done very well at a fair. And I honestly, Tyler was the only person I trusted. At that point, you know, we kind of had a relationship. And I would like to think that outside of all of this, that we're friends, because I think that we both kind of have a similar background of, you know, not being trust fund babies. And, you know, we both share this dream about, you know, I want to be an artist. He wants to be a gallerist. And I think that that's a big part of why we get along so well, is that we have a similar background and we both want to support each other in our dreams. And it's a really easy working relationship. You know, we could talk about, you know, different things on the phone for like 15 minutes, but the rest of the 45-minute conversation is us just like catching up. And I feel very fortunate to be able to have that kind of relationship with my gallerists, that like we're friends outside of, you know, this working relationship. And I think that's very rare that you are able to have that kind of relationship with your dealer, and the same, you know, vice versa with the dealer, with the gallery, with the artist. And I would say the same with Schwanda. I met her when I was in grad school through another artist, and we were just friends. And, you know, she was very supportive of the work, and which I'm always sort of like in shock when people are supportive of the work. And, you know, it's nice to have a friend that you trust that is really invested in your work. And it's more fulfilling to me when my friends are able to own my work. And, you know, it makes me feel good that she owns my work. But she's also, I think it's just like a very reciprocal relationship, you know, like she has been very supportive of my career. And then I've, you know, tried to connect her with as many people as possible. And we were just in the right place at the right time, and with a really great community of supportive artists. So I'm just grateful. I'm really grateful. These are 2 people who have been extremely supportive of my career from the beginning. So it's great to work with them.
And I want to emphasize that word trust, because it's very rare that we do talks with both the gallerist and the collector and the artist. You know, it really is kind of an anomaly. But also the way that the relationship, you know, has to be built on trust, and often it is not. You know, we always hear about these awful, you know, stories about how a gallerist was treated an artist, or, a collector is exploited, an artist and their work, etc. So that was part of the reason I thought a conversation with the three of you would be really insightful and enlightening. For you, Schwanda, you've been collecting since 2005 and have amassed quite an impressive collection of your own, exclusively of art exclusively by Black artists. And you've also started your own art consultancy where you place art, including, of course, Andrea's. Can you tell us how you were first introduced to Andrea's work? I think Andrea's already answered that you were friends in college, but what about the work resonated with you? And why? I think I have a question much later about placing the work, but what really resonated with you?
Right. I can't believe it's been since what, 2008, when we first met. I believe Andrea was completing her MFA at MIPA at the time, and we just organically met through mutual friends. And I think at the time when I was first introduced to her work, I was introduced to her printmaking process. Um, she was making these prints that address the tourism in the Caribbean. And what has drawn me to Andrea's work over the years is that as soon as you think you figured out what her practice is, she pivots to something else. And so the scholarship aspect of her work draws me in as a collector personally, because everything that's in my collection has a meaning. I know that there are a lot of collectors who are beauty seekers or they're focused on aesthetics, but that's not the focus of my collection. Her work just happens to be beautiful, but I think that the meaning of it is incredibly deep. And to me, she's a truth seeker and she's an advocate, and it's conveyed through her work constantly. There's a complete line through it. And I think just in terms of my patronage towards her practice over the years, it's not like this one shot transaction. It's a commitment. I believe in her practice. And what's really intriguing is, I guess, her thirst for knowledge and the amount of studying that goes into all of the work that she does. I remember um, sort of tagging along on a trip that I think you were actually studying out in Jamaica, dealing with
Wanda came for that. That was super, super sweet. And like, there was like some crazy family dynamics, but it meant a lot that you came for that. And I would say, like, outside of her being my collector, with capital C, she's my friend and we connect on quite a few different levels. Like, we're both mothers now.
Yeah.
I think we have similar interests. She's introduced me to a lot of amazing artists, one being Bethany Collins, who I like love to death, and had the great fortune of being able to meet. So I think it's more than it's just a collector artist relationship. I think it's like a true friendship. And I think a big part of what I love about what I do is making those kinds of connections with people and actually being able to call them like a sincere friend. And I'm very fortunate that, Schwanda is definitely one of them. That's a really rare relationship to have with a collector. And it started, before she even had my work. And it's something that I like hold very, very close to me. Like, I love being able to meet people like her, and they're people that I go to when I feel like I can trust and go to when I need advice, or when I just want them to like get me some feedback, or if I'm like I want to strangle my child, like just things like that. It's nice to have a person like that in your corner.
Right. And it's reciprocated. I mean, you introduced me to Joan Mitchell Foundation, and now I'm doing advisory work with them. But I just love sort of how deep you dig into your practice. I mean, for me, when I went to Jamaica and sort of tagged along, um, how you studied midwifery, and even the practice in terms of making the paper from birthing cloth. I was just like, wow, How'd you even think to do that? So your use of her, you know, the use of materials, and that level of creativity, but sort of tying it to history and so I think the pleasant thing about it is that the collectors sort of sometimes learn things about history and it's not intentional. It's just sort of what they sort of pull from looking at the work on their own. And it resonates with them and it resonates with me.
Fabulous. And that really leads to my next question. You both have talked, or all of you talked about, and you yourself have said, actually, Andrea, that your work is very labor intensive, from making the paper, et cetera. And that you like to think about your labor as a kind of homage to, you know, the ancestors and their labor. So I want to look at some of your earlier work where labor and its intensity are conceptually and historically linked, as you spoke about, Schwanda. So starting with this work, and we can just go quickly through in terms of descriptions, but can you kind of talk about this work and what the materiality, of course, and the kind of deeper historical context?
I've been working with sugar for a while. I sort of started exploring it in 2007 when I was in grad school, primarily looking at my grandmother in particular, my paternal grandmother. She died having her second leg amputated due to diabetes. She had gangrene in her leg. And sugar has just played an impactful role historically within my family. Diabetes runs through my family, but also, you know, a good portion of the Caribbean were also colonial, like sugar colonial islands. You know, they were exploited for their resources, bringing cane in from parts of India and Malay Islands and, you know, importing them to the Caribbean. So I had gotten a Fulbright and went to Mauritius, which is also a former sugar colony that had been colonized by the Dutch, the French, and the British. And a thing about me is that when I make work, I spend a lot of time thinking. I'm a slow maker. I don't like to just put things out very quickly. I actually like to take the time to think about whose story it is, my personal voice, the perspective in which I'm coming from. So I try to be incredibly respectful of anyone that is not of my culture or not coming from my, specific perspective. I see my perspective as being a child of immigrants, as being Caribbean American, as opposed to being Jamaican or Trini, because I didn't grow up on those islands. So I can only speak from my perspective as the child of immigrants and, you know, the complications of what that entails. So from Mauritius, you know, I was really interested in a particular part of the island, which is the southern part, this particular village called Lemourne. There were a lot of marooned enslaved people who established a village on top of Mount Lemourne, which was strategically selected because of its difficulty to scale. And I was fascinated with the idea that they took another trade like fishing and made it this revolutionary act. They took on a trade where they were like kind of chucking the deuce to their the plantation owners and their 7-year apprenticeship. Like, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to do this. And even though they are marginalized because of that choice, I find pride in the fact that they chose to take this trade that is, you know, slowly dying out now due to overfishing, and they took that and made it revolutionary in that decision. And it's this generational trade that's passed down. So I decided to sort of cast these boats that they use, they're called bateaux, and cast them out of sugar and allow them to sort of like melt over the duration of time to sort of talk about like the disappearance of the trade, but also wanting to acknowledge the importance of the choice of that trade, that they were just kind of like giving the middle finger to the former colonizer, like, I'm not going to do this to sort of sustain your failed plantation. I'm going to do this thing that is familiar to me to sustain my family. And I find that very powerful. So I also think that, like, the idea of a fisherman being, a lot of the former enslaved were from East Africa, or they were Malagasy from Madagascar. And there's this stereotype put on them as being lazy, savage. And I think that that's the complete opposite of what fishing entails. It's a very dangerous job. It's very, it requires a lot of patience. It's very time consuming. So I kind of like those two things opposing themselves, and finding this way to sort of honor that labor and what that labor means to that generational, that trade.
And continuing on somewhat the same theme of labor, literally, pure. Again, using ephemeral material, soap. Can you tell us a little bit about this work? Your work.
Schwanda was definitely there for this bit of research. I worked with a professor at Pitzer College, and her work was primarily on looking at Black midwives from the South, often referred to as granny midwives, and the importance of their position. They often serviced women in rural areas that had no access to health care, but then were later demonized by white doctors that actually learned obstetrics. I mean, modern day obstetrics is based off of these white doctors learning how to deliver babies from these Black midwives. So we went to Jamaica to sort of do a compare contrast on the practices there. My grandmother was a midwife in Trinidad, a very well-respected midwife. And we wanted to see if there were similarities or differences, and sort of discovered that there was a lot of African retentions within both practices in the US and in Jamaica. So one of the things that really stuck out to me in both locations was that this idea of these midwives as being dirty, simply because they were Black. And I sort of wanted to turn that on its head. And I was just like, I wanted to make these hands out of soap. And the idea of, there's a phrase in the US called catching babies, and it refers to like the midwives delivering the children. And so I sort of had these hands in the positions of catching, and making them out of soap, and giving the viewer the option to wash their hands with those hands of the midwives. And also sort of imbuing imagery of Yemaya, who is the Orisha of motherhood and childbirth, and sort of like kind of creating this acknowledgement to that, because we did see a lot of retentions that you can trace back to West Africa that did signify a lot of the Orisha practices there. So it was really interesting to sort of see that within both locations, and sort of like kind of find the ties that bind between the two locations.
And did you, in fact, use your own mother and mother-in-law's hands to cast?
Yes, I did. I tend to use my family members a lot for some of these works. They're around. My mother-in-law and my sister-in-laws are all here in San Diego, and then my mother just happened to visit. So I've incorporated them in a few pieces that I've created throughout the years.
So the work is always entwined with a kind of biography, right?
Yeah.
The connection to your family.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I can only make work that talks about the things that I know. And it would feel really inauthentic if I made work about something that I had absolutely no connection to in any kind of way. So I kind of stick to family members or histories that pertain to, my culture or where I'm currently living, things like that. It would feel weird to do that based on another entirely different culture that I'm not familiar with whatsoever. I feel like there are artists of that culture that are able to make those stories, and I don't need to be one of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the whole debate around appropriation then.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm very mindful of that. Yeah. It's why I work slowly.
Mm-hmm. And thoughtfully.
I try. I try to be as thoughtful as possible.
Yeah, and this work, Proverbs 12:22, that was part of the Rum, Sugar, and Gold, a post-colonial paradox at MOAD, I believe. Again, you're using sugar as your material. Can you speak about this one? I'm always struck by this work because I didn't realize the Bible until, I would see this work all the time. And then I realized, oh, these are Bibles that you have sculpted. So there's this kind of relational thing going on, but I'll have you speak to it in more detail.
This is my favorite installation I've ever done because it was very off the cuff. I was asked to be in the show primarily because of my relationship to sugar and the materials. And I was initially thinking about the idea of "I swear on a stack of Bibles," that phrase. And I had initially wanted to stack all these Bibles on top of each other. But, realistically, I was only there for a couple of days to install, and we had some issues. Like the first Airbnb I was in had no stove at all. So then I moved to the curator's apartment in her kitchen. So all the burnt, very dark colored sugar pieces are the ones that I had cooked in her apartment because my thermometer broke. And there was like sugar all over her apartment. And then I was in another place, and then I had like about 100 pounds of sugar to work with. So I just like cooked it until I completely ran out. And during my time in San Francisco, I sort of like walked around and went to a bookstore and found like a hymnal book that had Amazing Grace. I thought a lot about, I had just randomly took my beads with me, and then bought some rice and just sort of like imbued these Bibles with things that are often used to either signify various orishas or, talking about different histories of locations that were exploited by way of colonialism. So the one that you see on the left, that is the Amazing Grace hymnal, and like really thinking about how Christianity has sort of impacted colonized spaces, but also the Black community here within the US, and thinking about how, without the church, there would not have been the civil rights movement, but also how the church is used to demonize homosexuality, how there's this idea of, separation of church and state, which is why the gavel is there. But also thinking about how in places like Brazil and Haiti, how Catholicism has been a way to sort of mask traditional practices of voodoo, and also like sort of embedding offerings to different orishas. So like talking about the complications of the Bible and how it has sort of like impacted the diaspora. So initially, again, I wanted to stack them, but as I was like sort of laying it out on the plinth to figure out how I wanted to put it together, I took a picture of it, and my husband just, in passing said it looked like evidence. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting observation. So then I decided to sort of just lay it out that way. So I had different sizes of Bibles, from a pocket one to, the Gideon's to St. James version. Like I just casted everything and just sort of experimented. And I think for me, this was like a really fun project because it was very kind of like, you have to figure it out in the moment. And I think I work best in that way when I don't have everything completely planned out and I just get to play. It becomes a much more enjoyable experience for me. And then over the duration of time of the exhibition, the Bibles all melted and sort of like melded into each other, which was kind of like a really fun thing to like see.
It's an interesting metaphor. And I guess I wanted to come back to Schwanda and Tyler and ask you both what strikes you about, the ways in which Andrea's sculptural work has changed and, morphed, but kind of still retains, you know, the highly researched, as you said, Schwanda, scholarship. It's kind of connection to the ephemeral, again, the sugar, etc., and still addresses these histories around maternal care, colonialism, Christian missionary project, all of that. So I just wanted to kind of throw that back at you.
For me, the sculptural work speaks to the level of autonomy that she has as an artist, right? Because these works are not, they're not really built for the commercial market, which I love.
That's interesting. Yeah.
That's one of the things that I love about making these pieces also is that, you know, one of the first questions I get is like, how do you sell it? Or how much is it? And I'm just like, it's not meant to last. And I love that. Like, that's fun to me. And it sort of is my way of sort of addressing the art market in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I was first introduced to this sugar sculptural work, it was back in, I don't know, like 2013, maybe 2014, when she was doing a residency at the McCall Art Center in Charlotte. And I was so intrigued with the fact that the sugar, depending on the amount of heat that's in the space, could melt and how it just sort of organically transforms into something else. And to me, again, that just sort of speaks to the level of control that she had over her practice, and it's void of any influence on as to the art market or how much work she's going to sell or anything of that nature.
And Tyler?
Yeah, it kind of goes in line with what Schwanda was saying. It's interesting for me as a gallerist to have that conversation with collectors or museums or someone interested in buying something. And it kind of does weed out what I would personally call like weaker collectors or stronger collectors, a collector that can be okay with that, with a piece that maybe changes over time. It really brings out like a different conversation. And some people think a lot of the times it's going to be like a quick, like, oh, okay, I can't handle that. But a lot of times it's surprising what people will be okay with and want to, and they want to support the work. And it also sometimes does create challenges, but you know, over time we've come up with different like solutions to different things, like the work that the AGO has. Not that particular one, but ones from that series were shown unframed, and the sugar was meant to fall off the work over the period of the exhibition. So how does that work kind of exist outside of that space? And so that series of work, like all the shards were collected and they're framed within a frame. They're put at the bottom of the frame with the cyanotype and the sugar. So they're meant to even continually keep changing over time, like fall off into the bottom, or yeah, they can change. And it's an interesting thing to have to encounter when a lot of works, you kind of don't want to get you want to send them out in the best possible way so that they're archival or in different ways, but like you don't want to have that conversation about, oh, this changed or that, but this is the opposite. I enjoy hearing from people like, oh, here's a picture, like it changed, it looks like this now. I kind of like that.
I think it's
also
funny
like
is every time
okay.
I make work like that, I'm always like, I don't know how you're going to sell this, Tyler. And he was like, a challenge.
That's funny.
It's always funny because like I never think that he's going to be able to move it, but he does. And
Yeah.
I think it's a talent of him finding the right collector for the work, you know. And I think that's definitely a challenge, but it's also a gift in a lot of ways. Like he knows the right people to ask, and people who are really that invested in the work, because like I always tell him my worst nightmare is having somebody flip the work. And I think he's very cognizant of that. So he finds right collector that is interested in the longevity of the work, which is definitely my interest, is like how that work changes over time. And I think we're very much in sync with that, which is, it's one of the reasons why I think our relationship works very well, the gallery. So yeah, I'm grateful for that.
I was going to say that to me definitely speaks to the level of patronage that when someone's supporting the practice, they're not particularly concerned with what the value is going to be, say, in 10 years, or even if it's going to be present, and that's why I try to make sure that I counsel my clients as to the significance and the importance of supporting institutional loans, right? That the work doesn't technically belong to you. You're simply a custodian, right? And there's comes a certain level of responsibility with being a custodian, right? So I think that's the beauty of being a true patron.
I would say that all three of you are, definitely your ideas, yours in the making, Andrea, Schwanda in the care and placing of the work, Tyler in working with the artists and working with institutions or private collections. You're all very much in sync in terms of a kind of larger approach to this work that is kind of, moves from Andrea to all of you, right? It's so interesting. You're so acutely aware of the deeper concepts and ideas, and I would say the kind of ethics that
I
Andrea.
totally agree. And I think finding someone like both Schwanda and Tyler is very important to your career. When you aesthetically have a way of like sort of envisioning how the work is going to exist, to be able to find people who support that is so hard to find. It's really hard to find. And I just feel very fortunate that I have both collectors and a gallery that, they're not like, just pump out some work that's gonna move. They're very much about like the ethics of the work and the morals of the work and putting it in the proper place for it to be cared for by people who actually care for the work and aren't just trying to, make a buck.
It's not just a commodity.
Right. Like I don't like the idea of work as being like an investment, like you're gonna flip a house. Like that's so weird to me. Like don't buy work that you don't love. Like why would you put something in your house that you don't deeply love? And I think it's one of the reasons why I'm very careful about other artists that I buy work from. I mean, I don't have like a large budget. Like I wish I had like a ridiculous budget to collect people's work, but I buy people's work that I genuinely love and want to look at and stare at for years to come, to like sort of understand their process. I'm so fascinated with process, and I would hope that someone would feel the same way about, my work. I mean, I would love to be able to get to that point where, people are that fascinated with it. But I know that I personally collect people's work that is just mind-blowing to me, and I just want to sit there and examine it and find different ways to look at the work.
So kind of touching on some of the ideas we've just talked about, of course, Colostrum 2 is in Andrea's show, currently on view at the AGO. And Schwanda, you helped place a number of works from this series with several collectors. And I wanted to ask you, what excited you about this particular series? And again, coming back to process, but the process of working with these collectors. Maybe some were newer to collecting, some more established. How did you go about doing that?
One of the things that attracted the collectors to the work, and I will say it sort of ran the gamut in terms of novel collectors versus more what you would call sophisticated collectors, was the archival imagery and the portraiture, and sort of trying to figure out what the sentiment was in their facial expressions, the emotions that went along with it, but then also the intricate nature of the beading and some of the colostrum works. And then sort of me explaining how the artist actually handmade the paper in which the collage was applied to. So again, it was such a, for me, they're particularly special because they're so thoughtful. You can't make these works rapidly. And I know that Andrea was very mindful and intentional about creating these and sourcing the photographs. Um, but they're absolutely stunning. And the photographs doesn't give it any justice. Like I literally gasped when I got mine in when it was delivered and I took it out of the box. I was just like, oh my God. And then also just in terms of um relatability, like my daughter, who's now 6, like she saw the work and she had so many questions about it. Um, so again, that speaks to the work not really belonging to you, that it has a message for everyone. My collection is for my girls. That's the long-term plan, and I've spoken with Andrea about that in terms of legacy building. Um, but these works invoke conversation, and every collector who I've placed the work with gets it. They understand, and I would never place the work with someone who doesn't understand this, the scholastic aspect of the work and what was entailed, what it, was involved in making this work. So that's why I love the series.
Yeah, and I think you are also being very intentional, like Andrea, in terms of who you do place the work with. The Midwives series is again, you are, Andrea, um, referencing midwifery, it's kind of historical, um, uh, deep historical moments, I guess, in the Caribbean and in parts of Africa. But I was also interested in the ways in which Caribbean nurses studied midwifery in England, because my mother is one of those.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, there are several of my friends of a certain cohort whose mothers left Jamaica or Trinidad or Barbados in my context or experience, and went to London to study. So it's this kind of continuous, interest in that history that I find really, really interesting. And here again in Midwives 1, you have, created this collage as a kind of, again, homage to that history.
I was also really interested in like Mary Seacole and how she's this huge figure, but also like the unacknowledgement of the fact that she is of Caribbean heritage, and the vital role that she played in the UK. But also like the hiddenness of some of these traditional practices that are often incorporated in a lot of the modern day midwifery. I don't think people are aware of. I think we're aware of it at times. Some of us are not. One of the interesting things I heard while I was in Jamaica was this idea of like when we were backwards, which I thought was a really telling thing of like the colonized mind. So I sort of like to play with a lot of that. And just the fact that like there were, I took a class when I was in grad school at Hopkins on like immigration from like 1965 and like the impact of Caribbean nurses and teachers that came into the US and how they have sort of like, if you go to New York and you look at the nurses that are in a lot of these hospitals, they're dominated by women that are not necessarily American. And a lot of them are Caribbean, or like a lot of nannies, which is incredibly problematic to see in New York, are of Caribbean heritage, and there's something there to that. So I'm really interested in sort of talking about that and like, why is that so? And has anyone really considered the impact that these women have played in history?
I can't believe it's 4:50. I've been, so I've skipped a slide, but I wanted to talk about your most recent installation, because I just find it so fascinating. House of Historians, that was featured in Everything Slackens in the Wreck, and Dil Gossen's fabulous exhibition at the Ford Foundation Gallery, which you created in the gallery out of sugarcane scraps collected in Trinidad. And Dil told me the whole story, negotiations with a local farmer, et cetera. Fascinating.
It was quite an ordeal.
Yeah. You turned into this community bird's nest. Please tell us a little bit about it.
One of the things, like, I hold on to a lot of things that I have photographed, or just, I keep an extensive amount of sketchbooks. So like, I'll go back and refer to an idea that I thought of, or something that I saw from years ago. And one of the things that stood out to me were these weaver bird nests that I saw in Mauritius. And I was doing like a sugar chimney tour with this artist that was there. And we stopped at one sugar chimney, and I had never seen a weaver bird nest before. And they build these elaborate sort of like, they can take different shapes depending on the bird, but they were like these sort of oval shaped nests that they would sort of like burrow into. And I was like, oh my God, I've never seen this before. And they were made out of sugarcane because of like where they were. They just used the scraps around them. And I was like, this is such a crazy metaphor. So when Ansel contacted me, it was the first thing I thought of, and like this idea of sort of building community with what is available. And so I just had the vision of making this ridiculous, gigantic weaver bird nest that I could barely get out of my basement. And Endo was able to get sugarcane from Trinidad and have it. It was such an ordeal. It took like 4 months to get here. But the curious thing about it is that the town that Andel got it from was the town that his family was from, and also the town that my grandmother was from in Trinidad, Tunapuna. So it was just like this weird, like, I swear it's in some way that Andel and I might actually be related. Some way, if we were to do like a DNA test, I think that we literally might be related, because Trinidad is but so big. So it was just sort of like taking these scraps and seeing like, taking this wreckage, and the fact that as a region, we've been able to create this very unique and dynamic culture. And every island is very different, no matter how much people try to lump us together. We're very different. Just because you hear an accent doesn't necessarily mean they're Jamaican, which people take a huge offense to. So I wanted to sort of talk about the dynamics of being able to create something out of this tragic situation. And I think that speaks to every diasporic community, is that we've took, where we are now and combined it with where we come from. And we've created this very unique culture, which, entails everything, religion, food, tradition, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say continuing again on, the ways in which materiality, labor, process, how prolific you are really kind of seen in the Anthropocene series, as well as Litany for Survival, which of course we acquired. And these are two works acquired by institutions, one by the Getty, and of course the AGO. And I wanted, I guess, Tyler to comment on, and of course, Andrew, I'll ask you about the process in a minute, because it's cyanotypes and panels of cyanotypes, and you did those by hand. Very old, photographic process. But Tyler, can you comment on the interest you've received from various institutions or even private collectors in terms of acquiring these cyanotypes, because they're very, very special works?
Yeah, like you're saying, the one on the left was acquired by the Getty. And so I think out of all my years, like working in galleries or having a gallery, that was the sale that I worked on the longest. It was a conversation with the different curators to Getty for years, many years. And I think that's, you know, an important thing I do is I kind of handle those conversations as like the gallerist. It started when I first was working for Cyanotypes, and then it transitioned to me at my own gallery. Yeah, over the years, we've, you know, shown them at different different art fairs. They've been in different exhibitions, but they all kind of stem from different installations that have been broken into pieces. So you're getting kind of a piece of a larger work in a way. And so, yeah, it's grown over the years. Like those that I think have been the most acquired institutionally out of the work. Like the Cleveland Clinic has several works, the Getty, the one on the right on the screen was acquired by the Addison Museum. Yeah, they've been placed in lots of really amazing places. And so, you know, there's only so many of them. And so for me, it's now that they've started being placed, larger ones like the 4-panel or 6-panel don't exist in available works as much anymore. So it's important to me that they're not just like sold off like rapidly, that there's only going to be this many, and these need to go to places that can handle them and treat them. And they do have, you know, they are sensitive, they're light sensitive. So it's about also who can take care of them. And so, yeah, the Cyanotypes are, yeah, they're really interesting to work with. And yeah, there's something I think about a lot as a gallerist, like where are they going to go? How will they exist? And who can kind of take care of them?
And coming back to you, Andrea, I did see the Art 21 video where you have a child's pool and creating cyanotypes using the sun. I mean, really, really back to original technology. Do you remember that video, Art 21?
Yeah, it was actually a PBS special. It was an Art 21.
Right. Okay.
But no, I mean, yeah, I try to work as low tech as possible. I mean, outside of being an artist, I'm a parent, and I am very cautious about the materials that I use. I try not to work with toxic materials at all. I don't like to have them in the house. I'm working with resin right now, and I'm like, I need to like remove myself from the house and be outside. But I worked with these in particular because I knew it was safe for the house. I have him help me a lot of times. He likes to participate. He's my unofficial assistant. So I have him like with a hose, like washing everything down. And I think it's kind of funny because people think I have a lab that I work in, but I literally just print this on my porch. I have a big, huge sheet of glass on a table in front of my house, which looks crazy to my neighbors. And then I have like a little plastic kiddie pool that I just wash everything out, and that's pretty much it. And I like working in low-tech ways because it makes it accessible to anyone. Like, I'm not special in any kind of way. Anyone can go just like make their own negative at Kinko's and print this up. And I like that. Like, I like that it doesn't make art this like very elitist sort of thing that anyone can just make based on whatever they're inspired in. You know, like I've worked with kids at my son's, former school doing these kinds of things. So I like the accessibility in that way, that he can do that. And, for me, one of the most amazing things was having a piece placed at the Getty, because I used to work there.
Yeah.
I was like an admin assistant. So like to actually have the work in the collection was kind of insane. And I know that they will care for the work, because the first time I ever learned about cyanotypes was seeing Anna Atkins' pieces at the Getty. So for me, it's like this full circle sort of experience to like have the work there is kind of mind blowing. They're some of my favorite pieces to make because they are ephemeral, and everything that I work with now tends to be that way. And it's not a fixed process. Like, it's never going to turn out the same way no matter what you do. I like that if you expose it to sun long enough, it'll disappear.
Yeah.
There's an institution in Canada that borrowed, that lent some of the work that the AGO has, and like the conservator and I sort of like nerded out on how can I make this disappear really fast? Like, I love having those kinds of conversations because it's all about process and the possibilities of the material. So it's always something that I tend to go back to. And for these pieces in particularly, like Litany for Survival, was like trying to figure out how to incorporate the sugar, the work that I'd done with sugar with the process of cyanotypes, and just playing with ephemerality in that way. Like, I remember a piece came off and they freaked out, like, oh my God, what do I do? And I was like, just take some glue and just like pass that joint back on there. And I was like, it's meant to fall apart. You know, it's not gonna last forever. And just go with it.
Yeah. Well, that's a really hard concept for a museum.
I know.
Museum is not going to last forever. It has to.
I'm surprised that they keep buying it too. I'm like, okay, good job, Tyler. You suckered them into buying it. I'm like, you're doing an excellent job.
Oh boy, in the interest of time, Schwanda, I have one more question for you and then a final question for you before we open, Andrew, before we open it up for questions. Just thinking about the relationship between artists and collectors, which are as we said in the beginning, can be fraught, especially when thinking about imbalances of access and supply and power, et cetera. How do you kind of go about mediating some of these imbalances? In a really short answer, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, this is a constant conversation because access is getting tighter and tighter at the moment. Um, there is a lot of hype for artists who are completing their MFA programs to come out the gate demanding these elevated prices for their work. And I always sort of, wish that the artist would slow down. And so that's why I love Andrea's practice, is because her focus is not based on the market at all. And that's why she's really earnest in her creativity. And it's hard for artists. I mean, because the amount of stress and pressure that comes along with the practice, depending on what's happening in the world and what's happening in terms of, economics. And I mean, they sort of bear the brunt of everything, unfortunately. And so I really try to encourage the artists in terms of sustainability, if they're concerned about long-term sustainability, is to quiet that noise or try to ignore that and just continue on with their practice.
I think that's one of the benefits of living here, in particular in San Diego, is that there's not an art scene here. And I love the normalcy that I have, and I don't have the pressure of, being a robot and mass producing work. I will say I really respect that Tyler's just like, this is all she's gonna make. There's not gonna be any more. Like, let it go. And I appreciate that because I can't be a factory.
Yeah.
There's only so much one can do, in a short span of time. So yeah, I'm fortunate in that sense that I'm glad that I don't live in a major art city and I don't feel that pressure.
And speaking of pressure, I don't know if you felt any pressure to commission a work, especially for Questlove for the Oscars 2021 for his laptop. But I thought this was so intriguing. I only saw it on Instagram. But how did that come about very quickly?
Fortunately, I have known Amir for longer than I've known my husband, actually. He runs this website, OK Player, and it's for fans of the Roots. And there's some of us who've been there for a very long time. And they're actually really great with their fans in the sense that you can go to a live show and they'll actually like talk to you and give you the time of day. And just known him for a while. And there was an OK Player tour at one point, and they let me come and do drawings like live. And we've just kept in touch over time. He hired my best friend to DJ, and I was just like, hey, do you need any artwork? Like, I was just, being funny. Like, how about you do the case for my laptop? And I was like, sure. And he was like, but I need it in 2 weeks. And I was like, no problem. So I sort of like just busted it out, and I was still working on sort of like a lot of the colostrum work, and FedExed it to him, and he put it on, and it was on TV. And it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life, but it was amazing.
Yeah.
It was really amazing. Someone actually wrote a paper very recently on the impact of OK Player, and his Summer of Soul was actually art directed by a friend of mine who, again, we all knew each other from that same place. So it's just, he finds people that are creative, and he's very supportive of what they do. And I've been just fortunate that that he's done that, and he finds my child hilarious, which is even funnier to me. But so it's just been kind of funny, and he checks in from time to time to just see what I'm working on.
It's fabulous. Well, it's a wonderful work, of course, and the whole world, I imagine, or at least the Oscar audience, got a chance to at least engage with your work. So I'm going to, because we're so over time, but oh well, happens. Open it up to questions. Are there any questions? I have a question, if there are no questions, that I want to slip in, because you said you are teaching yourself how to, did you say weave? You're weaving?
Right, so I use a lot of beading, but I don't know how to like actually bead.
Right.
So I am teaching myself how to embroider with beads, and
Right.
it's called net beading. I'm basically like literally making a fishing net out of beads for
Right.
a
And that's what I
larger
want to ask you about.
installation. Yeah, it's for a larger installation I'm working on.
Wow.
And so I had to sort of like teach myself how to do it through YouTube, which has been a challenge. But yeah, so I just trying to learn any way that I can.
And is that related to, I don't want to give too much away in case you're not telling people exactly what you're working on, but is it related to a certain African folkloric person that lives underwater?
So I'm very interested in Drexia, which is like this mythic underwater kingdom that was created by this Detroit house music group called Drexia. And the myth of Drexia is formed from the idea of during the transatlantic slave trade, women who either pregnant women who threw themselves over the boats or threw their children over the boats, their children were born underwater to create this kingdom Drexia. So I'm making work right now for a show that sort of like explores the question of what would cause a mother to do something like that. So I'm interested in sort of investigating infanticide, why enslaved women made those decisions, and that it's not as cut and dry as it being murder. It's kind of coming into question, well, what would that entail if they had not done that? Were they setting their children up for a life of being enslaved and possibly raped and sold off? Or were they doing something revolutionary for their children? So I'm interested in sort of that dynamic and that question. And the net weave that I'm doing now is going to be Mami Wata's net.
Right, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, so like the actual catching of the children as they come underwater, and sort of like developing them and nurturing them and taking care of them. So I'm creating the sort of underwater space at the Kohler Art Center, where I'm sort of investigating what the midwife's role of providing these abortion teas and medicinal herbs for these women that were not just on actual ships, but on also plantations, and how these midwives served people to prevent them from having children, or teaching them different tricks. Like women would lactate for like 2 to 3 years sometimes, just so that they didn't have to work. I'm really fascinated in what midwives did externally to sort of like free these women in whatever ways they could. So the net is them sort of like catching. So the net is beaded with the colors of Mami Wata or Yemaya, depending on where you are. She is the Orisha of motherhood and children. So it's sort of like this idea of these hands will be reaching up to catch, there'll be cast hands of reaching up, and the net will be connected to the hands and sort of suspended from the ceiling to sort of catch the kids that are coming in.
Wow.
So yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that. For
I
sure.
owe you some images. I definitely owe you some images.
Well, I think people have been so nourished by this conversation, and maybe we'll replay this and then have some questions, and maybe I'll pass those questions on to you, Andrea, Schwanda, or Tyler. But I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for participating in this conversation. For me, it has been generative and insightful in terms of your practice, in terms of your collecting and consultancy, Schwanda, and Tyler, the ways in which you are operating your gallery and working with an artist such as Andrea. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Julie,
you.
for everything. You've been really great to work with, and I appreciate everything you've done.
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all. Well, I guess we can sign off. Bye. Take care. Take care of yourself.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.